Some people walk into your life quietly, no warning, no fanfare, and somehow, without a single word, they change the frequency of everything around them. That's what Celeste did the moment she stepped into that studio. She wasn't looking for anything. She was just trying to leave. And Orion Quigley, a man who had spent years learning to hear what people weren't saying, heard every single thing about her in the 30 seconds she tried to go unnoticed. He wasn't supposed to stop her. She wasn't supposed to stay. But there's a particular kind of tension that builds between two people who are both running from something, and somehow keep ending up in the same room. This is a story about what happens when the wrong timing meets the right person, when silence says more than any lyric ever could, and when the most dangerous thing two people can do is finally tell the truth. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and drop a like before we begin. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Now settle in, because this story starts now. The morning Celeste Delaney walked into Quigley Sound, she had exactly one plan: drop the drive at the front desk and disappear before anyone looked at her twice. Nashville in November had that particular gray coldness that makes everything feel a little more fragile than it actually is, and she'd been feeling fragile enough on her own. She pulled her coat tighter as she pushed through the glass door, the warmth of the studio lobby hitting her like a quiet exhale. The receptionist was on the phone, one finger raised in a polite 1 second, and Celeste was perfectly fine with that. She set the drive on the desk, slid a small sticky note beside it with the artist's name, and turned to leave. That was the whole plan. It was a good plan. It lasted about 9 seconds. Celeste Delaney. The voice came from somewhere behind her, low, unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to fill a room. She turned slowly, because something in the tone told her that rushing wouldn't help. He was standing near the hallway entrance, one hand resting against the doorframe, a pair of studio headphones hanging loose around his neck. Tall, dark hair, slightly unruly in the way that suggested he'd been working since early morning and hadn't thought once about a mirror. He was looking at her the way people look at something they've been trying to place for a while and have finally figured out. "That's me," she said carefully. "Orion Quigley." He didn't extend his hand right away. He just studied her for a moment, and she had the uncomfortable, oddly electric sensation of being genuinely seen. "I know who you are," he said. "I've been trying to confirm it for 2 weeks." She blinked. "Confirm what?" "That you wrote the last 4 tracks on the Harlan record." Celeste felt something tighten in her chest. Those tracks had been released under the artist's name alone, per the agreement she'd signed without reading closely enough. Because the money had been decent, and she'd needed it, and she'd told herself that credit wasn't everything. "I wrote them," she said, keeping her voice even. "Under contract. The terms were clear." "The terms were insulting," Orion said, "and there wasn't judgment in it, just fact." He finally pushed off the door frame and walked toward her, and she noticed he moved like someone who never second-guessed where he was going. "Come see something." It wasn't a question. She should have said no. She was freelance, unscheduled, and entirely uninvested in whatever Orion Quigley wanted to show her. She also hadn't had a real conversation with another person in 4 days, and she hated herself a little for how much that mattered right now. She followed him. The studio he led her into was smaller than she expected, intimate almost, with warm wood paneling and low lighting that made it feel less like a workplace and more like the inside of a thought. He pulled up a file on the mixing board, hit play, and a voice filled the room. She recognized the melody immediately. It was one of hers. But what she heard underneath it, the production, The space Orion had built around her words made her breath catch. He'd treated her lyrics like they meant something, like they were the point. "I want to do a full project," he said, watching her face. 3 weeks. You write, I build. Real credit, real rate, nothing buried in fine print." Celeste looked at the soundboard, then back at him. He was waiting, patient and absolutely certain she was going to say yes. She hadn't decided yet, but she was still standing there, and they both knew what that meant. She said yes on a Thursday. By Monday, she already regretted it. Not because of the work, but because of how much she didn't regret it, and how unsettling that felt. The agreement was simple: 3 weeks, 5 days a week, 4 hours per session minimum. Orion had an artist in mind, a singer-songwriter named Dara Cole, who had raw talent and zero instinct for words. And he wanted Celeste to build the emotional architecture that Dara couldn't access alone. What Celeste hadn't anticipated was that Orion would be present for every single session. Not hovering, he wasn't the hovering type, but there, occupying the chair at the mixing board, with the quiet authority of someone who considered attention a form of respect. The first session was professional and slightly combative, which she suspected was exactly how he preferred it. He'd push back on a lyric, she'd defend it, and somewhere in the friction, they'd land on something better than either of them had started with. Dara sat in the corner, watching them, like she was witnessing a tennis match she hadn't been invited to play. "You two are kind of terrifying together," Dara said at one point, not unkindly. Orion said nothing. Celeste said, "We just disagree well," and didn't look at him when she said it, but she felt him look at her. By Wednesday of the first week, a rhythm had settled in. Celeste would arrive with pages of handwritten drafts. She'd never been able to work digitally, something about the resistance of pen on paper that kept her honest. And Orion would read them in silence before saying anything. She'd learned quickly that his silence wasn't indifference. It was processing. He read like he listened to music, with his whole body slightly still, and she found herself watching him do it more than she meant to. He had good hands. She noticed that in an abstract, unhelpful way. The kind of observation she filed away and tried not to revisit. Long fingers, a small scar along his left knuckle that she hadn't asked about. He worked with them constantly, adjusting levels, tapping rhythms against the desk without sound, pressing 2 fingers to his mouth when something wasn't quite right. She was careful not to let that become interesting to her. She wasn't entirely successful. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that Orion was doing the same kind of quiet accounting. He noticed the way she chewed the end of her pen when she was rearranging lines in her head. The way she'd go very still, right before she said something she actually meant, as opposed to something she was offering as a placeholder. He'd worked with dozens of writers over the years, and most of them performed their process. Celeste didn't perform anything. That was rare enough to be disarming. On Friday afternoon, Dara left early for a sound check across town, and for the first time, Celeste and Orion were alone in the studio. The absence of a third person changed the air in the room in a way neither of them acknowledged. Celeste kept her eyes on her notebook. Orion kept his on the board. "This line," he said finally, turning the page toward her and pointing. "It's too safe." "It's honest," she said. "Honest and safe aren't the same thing." She looked up then, and he was already looking at her, and the studio felt suddenly, inconveniently smaller than it had all week. She rewrote the line, not because he was right, or not only because of that, but because his challenge had loosened something she'd been holding too tightly, and the new version came out in under a minute, raw in a way the original wasn't. She slid the notebook across the desk without a word. He read it. Something shifted in his expression, subtle enough that she almost missed it. Almost. "That's the one," he said quietly, and there was no triumph in it, just recognition. She pulled the notebook back and told herself the small warmth spreading through her chest was professional satisfaction. It was easier than the alternative. The weekend passed the way weekends did when she was in the middle of a project. Restlessly, with her mind half somewhere else, she cleaned her apartment, went to the farmer's market on 8th Avenue out of habit, bought coffee she didn't need and a candle she definitely didn't need, and spent Sunday evening rereading everything she'd written that week, with the particular anxiety of someone who suspects they've shown too much of themselves. Some of those lyrics were personal in ways she hadn't fully admitted while writing them. That happened sometimes, the distance of craft making it safe to say things she couldn't say directly. The question now was whether Orion had noticed. She suspected he had. That suspicion made Monday morning feel heavier than it should have. When she arrived, the studio smelled like fresh coffee and something faintly cedar, a candle on the corner shelf she hadn't seen before. Orion was already there, jacket off, sleeves pushed to the elbows, head bent over a set of printed waveforms, with a pencil tucked behind his ear. He looked up when she came in, and for a half second before his expression settled into its usual composure, she caught something. Not quite a smile, more like relief, quickly contained. "Coffee's fresh," he said, already looking back at his work. It was such a small thing. She poured herself a cup and didn't make anything of it. But the cedar candle stayed lit all morning, and she found herself breathing a little slower because of it. Dara was in good spirits, which helped. She'd performed 2 of the new songs at her sound check and reported that her band had immediately responded to the emotional directness of the lyrics. "They said it actually sounds like me now," Dara said, dropping into her chair with the easy satisfaction of someone who'd been handed a gift they'd been too afraid to ask for. "That's the point," Orion said from the board. Then, without looking up, "That's Celeste." Dara grinned. Celeste looked down at her notebook. It was a simple sentence, factual even, but the way he'd said it, with that quiet certainty, like her name and quality were the same word, did something to her equilibrium that she spent the rest of the session carefully ignoring. They worked through the afternoon, and by the time the light through the studio's single high window had gone from gold to gray, they'd finished the structural draft of the album's 3rd track. Dara left with her usual energy, already humming. Orion began saving files. Celeste gathered her things slowly, the way she always did when she wasn't quite ready to return to her apartment and its particular brand of silence. "You don't like leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked up. He was watching her with that same steady attention, and this time, she didn't look away first. She could have deflected. She was good at deflecting, had built something of a quiet art form out of it over the past year. The gentle redirect, the surface answer that satisfied without revealing. But something about the way he said it, without pressure or pity, just plain observation, made deflection feel more exhausting than honesty. "My apartment's very quiet right now," she said. "Not the good kind of quiet." He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once, like that made complete sense to him. He didn't push further, didn't offer unsolicited opinions about her life, and she was grateful enough for that restraint that she almost told him more. Almost. She left shortly after, and the walk to her car was cold and clear, the kind of Nashville night that smells like wood smoke and distant rain. She sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine, replaying his voice saying her name the way he had to Dara. That's Celeste. Simple, certain. Like she was a known quantity, worth naming. She couldn't remember the last time someone had said her name like it meant something good. The second week shifted the dynamic in ways that were hard to pinpoint, but impossible to ignore. The sessions ran longer, not because the work demanded it, though it always did, but because neither of them seemed in any particular hurry to end them. Dara noticed. She said nothing, which Celeste appreciated, though the knowing look she threw over her shoulder on Tuesday afternoon was commentary enough. It was during Wednesday's session that the first real crack appeared. Orion wanted to restructure the bridge of the fourth track, pulling apart a lyrical sequence that Celeste had spent 2 evenings building. She understood his reasoning. The melody he was working with needed more negative space, fewer syllables in that section. But understanding something and accepting it were different animals. "You're cutting the only line that tells you why she stayed," she said, keeping her voice level. "The listener doesn't need to be told why," he said. "They need to feel it. And if they don't, if they miss it entirely, then the song failed before the bridge." She set her pen down with more precision than was strictly necessary. Across the room, Dara became very interested in her phone. The argument lasted 20 minutes and resolved the way their disagreements always did. Somewhere neither of them had planned to go, a third option that emerged from the collision. Orion cut half the line and restructured the melody around what remained, and the result was genuinely better, which was the most irritating possible outcome. He knew it too. The corner of his mouth moved when she admitted it. Not quite a smile, but close enough to be distracting. What changed that afternoon wasn't the argument. It was what happened after. They were listening to the playback, both leaning toward the speakers, with the unconscious focus of people who hear music as information. And at some point, Celeste had shifted forward in her chair, and Orion had shifted back in his. And when the track ended, she turned to say something and found him closer than expected. Not inappropriately close, just close. Close enough that she could see the particular dark brown of his eyes had a thin ring of amber near the center that she'd never noticed before, because she'd never been quite this near. Neither of them moved for a breath too long. Then his phone rang and the moment dissolved, and he answered it, and she turned back to her notebook and wrote down 3 words she didn't plan to use in any song. She never wrote those 3 words in a song, but she thought about them more than she should have for the rest of that week, turning them over in her mind the way you press a bruise, not to cause pain, just to confirm it's real. The weekend brought an unexpected interruption in the form of her mother calling from Knoxville, which was never a brief conversation and always left Celeste feeling like she'd run a race she hadn't trained for. Her mother meant well. That was the thing about people who complicated your life with love. The intention was never the problem. The problem was the questions. Are you seeing anyone? Are you eating enough? Have you talked to Priya lately? That last one landed differently than the others. Priya had been her closest friend for 6 years, the kind of friendship that felt structural, load-bearing. And then, 14 months ago, a misunderstanding that should have been a conversation became a silence that became a wall. Celeste had replayed it enough times to have memorized every moment where she could have done something differently. She hadn't called. Priya hadn't called. And now there was just this absence, shaped exactly like a person she used to tell everything to. "I'm fine, Mom," she said, which answered none of the questions, but ended most of them. She spent Sunday writing things that had nothing to do with Dara's album. Personal work, the kind she never showed anyone. Pages that were more excavation than craft, digging through layers she usually kept undisturbed. It helped, the way painful things sometimes help. She arrived Monday morning sharper than usual, which Orion noticed within the first 10 minutes. He didn't comment on it directly. Instead, he slid a coffee across the desk before she'd asked and said, "New material?" nodding at the notebook she was gripping slightly harder than necessary. "Maybe," she said. "Not for this project." "I didn't say it was." He turned back to the board, giving her space without making it obvious he was doing so, and she felt that small, careful gesture more than she expected to. The session that day was different in texture, less friction, more ease, the kind of working rhythm that takes time to build, and feels almost dangerous once you have it because you start to rely on it. At one point, Orion played a new arrangement he'd been developing overnight, something instrumental and unfinished, and asked her to just listen and tell him what she felt, not what she thought. She closed her eyes. The music was spare and low, built around a piano line that kept almost resolving and then pulling back, like something reaching for something it wasn't ready to touch. "Longing," she said when it ended, with the decision in it somewhere. He was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "That's what I was trying to find." When she opened her eyes, he was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. Focused, and something beneath focused that was more personal and less professional than anything that had passed between them before. He looked away first this time, and Celeste, who had spent a year becoming fluent in the language of people pulling back, recognized the motion with a clarity that surprised her. He was being careful. So was she. The question neither of them was asking yet was how long careful was going to be enough. The third week arrived with a cold front that dropped Nashville into genuine winter overnight. Celeste noticed it the moment she stepped outside Tuesday morning. The air had a different weight to it, the kind that makes everything feel more deliberate, more consequential. She'd been telling herself for days that what was building between her and Orion was simply the byproduct of proximity and creative intensity. People who made things together developed a particular closeness that could mimic something more personal without actually being it. She'd believed that explanation completely until the moment she walked into the studio and found him standing at the window with his back to the door, looking out at the gray Nashville skyline, and felt her chest do something inconvenient and unmistakable at the simple sight of him. He turned when he heard her. "Dara's not coming in today," he said. "She's got a vocal strain, doctor's orders." Celeste set her bag down. "So we reschedule? Or we use the time?" Something in his tone was different. Not warmer, exactly. More unguarded. Like the absence of a third person had removed a filter he hadn't realized he was using. They spent the first hour working separately in comfortable silence, Celeste drafting an alternate version of the album's closing track, while Orion built an instrumental framework at the board. It was the most relaxed she'd felt in the studio, which made her trust it slightly less. Around noon, he ordered food from a place 2 blocks over. Barbecue, unpretentious, the kind of meal that arrives in paper wrapping and tastes like someone's grandmother made it. They ate at the small table in the corner of the lounge area, and for the first time since the project began, they talked about things that had nothing to do with music. She told him about the farmer's market. He told her he'd grown up in Murfreesboro, 30 minutes outside the city, in a house where his father played guitar on the porch every Sunday, whether anyone was listening or not. "Is that why you do this?" she asked. "Because of him?" Orion considered it seriously, which she'd come to understand was the only way he considered anything. "Partly," he said. "Partly because I'm better at hearing people than talking to them." She looked at him across the table. "You talk to me fine. You make it easy." The words landed quietly between them. He didn't dress them up or walk them back, just let them sit there. And Celeste felt the specific vertigo of a moment that is asking you to be brave. Later, back in the studio, she was reaching across the board to point out a section on the waveform when his hand moved at the same moment and covered hers. Not reaching for her, just landing there, coincidental and warm, and absolutely still once it happened. Neither of them moved. "Celeste," his voice was low and entirely serious. "I need you to know that what I'm about to say has nothing to do with the project." She turned to look at him and found him closer than the geography of the room should have allowed. Close enough that she could see that amber ring in his eyes again, and this time there was nothing to interrupt them. Nothing ringing, nothing pulling them back. Don't finish that sentence, she said softly, and then immediately understood, from the way something shifted in his expression, that she'd said it wrong, that she'd borrowed his words from weeks ago and flipped them, and that the meaning between them had just changed completely. He smiled then, slow, real, and just slightly undone. And Celeste felt the last careful wall she'd been maintaining develop a crack straight down the center. If you felt that, if something just shifted in your chest the way it shifted in hers, drop a number in the comments. 1 to 10. How deep are you in? This was part 1. Part 2 is already waiting. The only question is whether you're ready for what happens when careful stops being enough.